Then there's California, a podcast featuring members of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus in conversation about their lives, their legislative priorities, policies, and other related issues that help make California exceptional. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. It was recently announced that Sheryl Sandberg, the chief operating officer of Facebook Meta, is leaving her position with Meta, a title and career that has made her one of the highest profile working women in American business of the last decade. Ms. Sandberg, as you may remember, was the author of the overwhelmingly best-selling book Lean In, published in 2013. It was considered by many women at the time as a Bible of sorts, a roadmap to success in the workplace and also to corporate life. When Lean In was published 9 years ago, just 4% of chief executives at Fortune 500 companies were women. The Me Too movement hadn't yet come alive, spotlighting abuses women can face in the workplace. The term #GirlBoss wasn't yet trending. And there was also not, at the time, as robust a discussion, if there was any discussion at all, about the systemic economic and social issues holding back women in the workplace, a dynamic that came into sharper focus during the COVID pandemic, which impacted women in the workforce, especially working moms, and put the American economy into what was cleverly but truthfully called a she-cession. On this episode of Then There's California, we'll continue the conversation about women in the workforce 2022, the impact of the pandemic on that workforce, the rising number of women in positions of leadership and corporate power, but also contrasted with the impact of the pandemic on those women and the number of women who have actually left the workforce, the higher unemployment rates for women of color, and what has been called by some, and is clearly evident to most of us, the ever-present patriarchy on our judicial benches, in our boardrooms, and even on the factory floor, who want to roll back fragile women's rights and make sure that glass ceiling has as few cracks as possible. We are very glad to have back with us Monique Limón, who represents the 19th Senate District on California's South Coast, encompassing all of Santa Barbara County and a good portion of Ventura County. Senator Limón chairs the Senate Banking and Finance Committee, and she and her husband Michael are parents to a little girl named Gianna. And in fact, Senator Limón joined us on this podcast right before the holidays in 2021 with a couple of her Senate colleagues, in what was one of the most delightfully candid episodes that I have done so far, about the art and angst of being a senator parent. Senator Limón, good to see you again.
Thank you, Brian. It's great to be back talking about an issue that I care deeply about, but also fun to reminisce on what it's like to be a parent in the legislature and share those stories with my colleagues.
Absolutely. How are you? How is 2022 treating the good senator from Santa Barbara so far?
So I will say that 2022 has been an incredibly busier year. I think coming out of the pandemic, so many of us as legislators have certainly felt the energy, the workload, and really an abundance of also unexpected issues, including inflation, world politics, and war. And I think that all of that has certainly kept us very busy. So 2022 feels like a very different year in the legislature, but busy years make the year go by fast.
Yes. Now, the big question all inquiring minds want to know, how is Gianna doing? She's like a year and a half now?
Yes. Gianna's 19 months. She is active. She is walking, running, climbing. That's her thing. And she is talking. So she's saying her first words and sentences, and it's all been quite fascinating and fun to have all of that happen in my time in the legislature. So she's doing well. Thank you.
She is with you here in Sacramento now. So what does Gianna do when you are busy legislating and sitting doing podcasts and other things? What is she up to?
While mommy does work, Gianna back home is in a daycare that is run through our Santa Barbara City College Center, and here up in Sacramento, she's actually with a babysitter, and so she gets to have the best of all worlds, to be at a center, but also to be at in-home care. So she keeps busy. She loves the outdoors, so both at the daycare center and at the babysitter, she really enjoys her outdoor time, playtime.
I know you often bring Gianna on your trips to Sacramento, and you've become an expert, I know at this point, on all things involving air travel with children. And I did read on your social media of this uncontained excitement that Southwest Airlines now has a direct flight from Santa Barbara to Sacramento, so that trip on the 101 down to Burbank and back and forth, the clouds must be parting, the sun must be shining for you, right?
It is definitely a game changer. I think what people don't always realize that how we get to work really takes a toll when it's, a 5 to 6 hour commute each way. And so having a direct flight from Santa Barbara to Sacramento on Southwest, now it only flies once a day each way, but I'll take that, has been, it just started. So yesterday was my first flight.
Wow, okay.
And I have to tell you that what's been fascinating is that as soon as that flight was announced, I had so many legislators, both in the Assembly and the Senate, Republican and Democrat, reach out to me and say, oh my goodness, how exciting. You finally get a direct flight, because after 6 years, I think legislators in LA County all know, they've all seen me on planes. They've seen me with my little ones. They always offer to lend a hand. And so it's been quite, I feel like a community excitement, not just for myself individually, but I've been really happy to see how happy my colleagues are for me, because they know what that means to be able to say, hey, I can drive a short distance to get on a plane and go to work, as opposed to do a 2 to 2.5 hour drive from the airport to home. That's a lot of hours. And certainly that's even more hours if you're going home in the middle of the week to try to make it to district events. So this is a game changer. We're very excited about it, and we're crossing our fingers that it's here to stay, because we also know that sometimes these flights come and go, but we're hoping it's here to stay.
And preoccupying hours, too, when you have a little one with you. So they're obviously thinking of you in the last year and a half, and the game changer it is in that respect, too.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely. And I will say that I think sometimes people don't realize it, but on very busy weeks when I had to travel back home in the middle of the week, there would be weeks where I would spend 20 to 24 hours a week in a car or on a plane trying to get to and from work in the district. And so it's that aggregate amount that is what really, I think, I gain back in some ways, and I'm able to then do different work in those 20 to 24 hours that I'm not using just in a plane or in a car. Now, I have gotten exceptionally good at doing Zooms or taking calls while driving, and of course doing it safely or on a train or something like that.
Glad you added that
But
disclaimer.
yes, that has been something that I've done hands-free, but have learned to also do, just because when you're spending that much time on the road, you don't really have an option but to really think about how you maximize your time as a legislator with so many constituents and so many issues happening here in Sacramento.
How are you doing with all of this, the balancing of motherhood and work? And yes, this is a question I would ask a male senator. In fact, I have. But how are you dealing with it?
I think I'm doing it. The fact that this is a job that I started without a child, now have a child, I feel like I don't know another way to do it. You wake up every single day and you do what you can that day. I think that motherhood and our professional life isn't always designed to be wrapped up with a very pretty bow, looking very neat. There are weeks where every week is slightly different in terms of my schedule, but we make it work. 19 months in, we have figured out a way to make it work. I've become an incredibly good scheduler compared to where I was, because I'm scheduling for my child, scheduling for myself, and working with a team of people who are super helpful. So we make it work. And I think that the most important thing about this experience is that it's the experience of millions of individuals in our state and our country. And so when you think about that, all of these experiences also shape how we look at policy and the way that we think about it and the direction we want to go. I've never been so passionate, but also so well informed about what the daycare situation is like in California and understanding those issues. And that's just one of many issues. I mean, scheduling as a whole, right? There's labor groups that are constantly asking us for certainty in scheduling. Well, I get it. If you have a family, that's really, really meaningful. And again, these are things that millions of Californians go through. So I just add myself to that list.
In our last podcast discussion about being a senator parent, you reminded us of your distinct place in Senate history. I think you said as the first senator in 2 decades to have a baby while in office. And while I know you didn't necessarily plan to make history or set records in this way, kudos to you for making that history, making it work, making the exception a little less so. And we didn't really have a lot of time to showcase that distinction on that past episode, but let's do so now. In an institution where women in the Senate didn't even have a restroom until 1977 because they had to build one for the first woman who was elected to the Senate at that time, this is something to make note of. I mean, congratulations for making this more common.
Thank you. And it's definitely a moment to be proud of. It's also a moment to reflect on all of the things that we have left to do. There are definitely more men in the California State Senate who have had children, but you just don't see as many women in the state Senate who have been in that position. I think that that's something that's going to change, but there also brings an awareness as more women and more parents take on these jobs as legislators. There's issues that we care deeply about. I know that moving into this building, when I first did my tour, I was like, all right, where are the restrooms? Where's the baby changing station? There's the lactation room. And the number of people who have to interface with Sacramento that have asked me these questions is actually endless, because lobbyists, staffers, other members have asked me, oh, how does that all work? And I'm able to share that experience and also do so with the hope that that's going to become a norm, right? That we won't have a first or a second person who has a child while in office, that will just be part of the experience. It's definitely more normalized.
Apropos sort of indirectly of this, but as a working mom, I wanted to get your perspective on the news of this past month or so of the unsettling baby formula shortage. And notwithstanding the supply challenges and the economic consequences and the lack of manufacturers that close down and open up again, there seems to be this parallel dialogue going on. It's taking women to task for depending on formula to feed their children and not breastfeeding. Why are you giving your baby formula? You should be breastfeeding. God designed mothers to feed their babies. Even to a middle-aged white guy, this sounds really insulting. I mean, formula is better than the alternative, which is starvation. And, until formula was developed, starvation was the option. What do you say to this attitude that seems to be, we celebrate motherhood in theory, but when it comes down to the survival of it, we're not quite so generous?
Well, I will tell you this, that I do not pass judgment on mothers or parents that do everything that they can to feed their children. For me, that was very concerning and alarming, and in a real way, to find parents in a situation where they wouldn't have access to food to feed their newborns. I don't care how you put it. I don't care what judgment there is. That is a great policy concern. And I think that it's also misunderstood. I feel like what's misunderstood is the fact that every woman is in a very different position in terms of the breast milk they may or may not be able to supply, and for different reasons. And one of those reasons is actually going back to work. The cost of living is extremely high these days. The cost for goods is high. And so I know so many parents that are like, I have to go back to work. I have to do part of this. But truly, to go back to work starts to have an impact on your body. And that impact on your body has the potential to also have an impact on lactation itself. And so I think that these are all real issues. It was very hard to see the judgment that came from some, not all, who didn't understand the way that breast milk works and how a body works, and how there's a lot of conditions outside of the individual's just willingness and desire that impact lactation and breast milk supply. And so I think taking that aside, we still had a policy issue. I know that I looked into information because our UC system here in California has a breast milk bank. And so we were looking to see what that could do to help families in need. And so I think that there was a lot of, what I saw were a lot of people stepping up to say, here's what we can do. I'm on social media, like mom group pages, and the number of people who said, I have this formula available if anybody needs it. Here's the expiration date. I mean, just over and over. That's because wonderful. This became an incredible need. And I think that we are tasked to really look at how we can, as policymakers, solve some of these complicated problems. I mean, these are little ones. We can't hand them other food that adults or just toddlers. What my toddler eats now versus when they were a newborn or an infant is completely different. I understood that in a very deep, real, and recent way.
Thank you for sharing that. Keeping all of this in mind and moving on, looking at where we are in 2022 and what the past 2 years have taught us or reminded us, a lot of focus being placed on how the economic impact of the pandemic impacted working women, working moms, and the systemic issues holding back women in the workplace even still, especially women of color and low-income women. COVID has heightened these impacts more profoundly. Has it really been a she session from your perspective?
I absolutely believe this has been a she session. The challenges with that is that the pandemic was complicated and challenging to so many people, not just women, but we saw that women were disproportionately impacted because we saw them leave the workforce. And this was across industry. This presumption that it may have only been in one industry or the other isn't quite factual. It was really across industries that we saw this. And so we saw that women were taking the lead for being the caretakers at home, for being the new educators, the stay-at-home folks who were providing the educational support at a time where our schools were either hybrid or Zooming or all online, whatever model they were, you needed someone at home. And so you saw this pattern, and I think it's now a pattern that we're dealing with. Certainly now we're coming, hopefully, out of the pandemic, and you don't see that all of the women who left the workforce in terms of percentages have come back into the workforce.
Absolutely,
and that continues to be a really big issue. And as policymakers, we ask ourselves, what are the reason? Are there policies that could help? And what kinds of investments do we need to make to ensure that women are able to go back to the workforce? And the reason that this is so important is because you also have to remember that in the state of California, when the majority of the population identifies as a woman, and you see that the majority of the population is not working, it has real economic impacts.
Absolutely.
And so combine that with the fact that, again, all industries are telling us that they are short-staffed, that they need more employees. So we're trying to grapple with a complex set of problems, but related to what came out of the pandemic and also who is or is not in the workforce and what the reasons are for not being in the workforce.
Well, we have the She Session, and we also have the Great Resignation. A stat I saw recently said that more than 200,000 women joined the labor force in March. And in fact, more than half of April's job gains went to women. But there are still thousands of women, maybe 1 million of them, who are missing from that labor force. So considering everything you're saying, how do we get them back?
I mean, I think that there's a lot of ways we get them back. And I think specifically for me, one of the things that, as you may know and others may know, is pay equity is very important to me. And pay equity has been something that our California legislature has been working on for decades. This is not anything new. We continue to see that a workforce that pays men and women a different amount for the same job is a problem. And we see that that's not necessarily an incentive or a reason for women to go back into the workforce if they know they're going to be shortchanged. So I think that that's one of the great elements. Certainly, I think that women are looking for jobs that allow a certain level of flexibility. I think that that's not just women. We are seeing now that a lot more, right? That to be able to balance what happens in the workforce, outside of the workforce, that's something that's a very new element, I think, that's been added. Is this all hybrid work? Is this a combination of in-person and out of the office work? What does the work situation look like? So I think all of these questions are questions that we are asking. But for me, one of the things that I've certainly focused on is pay equity and really closing that gender and race gap when it comes to salary.
Well, you have authored legislation this session that is attempting to help close the wage gap by requiring the disclosure of salary ranges on all job postings in California, and also requiring publicly the breakdown and report of data by gender, by race, by ethnicity. And you remind us with this bill that salary disparities are literally costing women. So tell us about SB 1162.
SB 1162 is a bill that does two things. One is it requires companies of 15 or more to have a salary range when they are posting a job. Now, for people listening, they may say, well, doesn't everybody already do that? It turns out that most do, but not all. And that piece is so key. Knowing what the salary range is when you apply for a job is very, very key to your base salary, right? And your potential for growth for jobs. And it's key to negotiating as well. And we have learned that having that information, evidence has showed us, research has showed us, is really important for all, but particularly for women and for underrepresented folks in terms of being able to compete for the salary that is deserving of the same job. So we applaud all the businesses in California that already do that. I know I, in my lifetime, have applied. 90% of the jobs that I've applied to have had a salary range, a starting salary range when they're posted. And so we applaud those that are already doing this, and we're asking those that don't to please do this, because this is part of how we address the gender wage gap as well as the racial wage gap. And so that's the first thing that it does. And the second thing that Senate Bill 1162 does is it says, look, we've been collecting data on this for quite some time, and a state agency collects it, but we can't solve a problem we can't see. So we are asking for this data in a course of the next 5 years to be accessible to the public. And this isn't data that identifies individuals on a singular basis. This is aggregate data for companies and for industries. And the reason we are asking that this information be public is so that we can address it. We can understand where are the trends, who's doing it well, and how do we model those companies that are doing it well, and where are there still challenges, and how do we try to address those? So I see Senate Bill 1162 as a tool in the toolkit of so many laws that we've tried to pass to address this. And for me, this is an issue that continues to require looking at and exploring, because it's been well over 5 decades where we've known that this data exists. We know that there is a gap, but we have struggled to be able to narrow and close that gap. I don't know that this bill alone will close the gap, but I absolutely believe it is part of the toolkit that narrows the gap when it comes to salary discrepancies for the same job.
There is not a lot of support for this bill from industry and the business community and those who represent the business interests. And one of their concerns is the transparency that you mandate, the lack of confidentiality of the stats, and their belief that this data being collected was never designed to show the disparities that you're looking for. And how dare you make a big deal about pay equity when these pay disparities are just, like you say, been facts of life for 50 years.
Well, I will tell you that I regret that there is opposition from, the big corporations, especially on some of this. But you look at companies, for example, like Intel. They're already doing this, and they seem to be doing well by doing this. It's information that helps their employees. And so that's what we're trying to actually model. Again, I think that it is, as a woman, as a Latina, it is extremely hard for me to accept that if you identify as someone like me, the odds are you're going to be getting 44 cents to the dollar for the same job. I think that while that may be a fact of life that some entities want us to accept, it is not a fact of life that I have been represented to accept. And so I think that that is really important, that we as legislators understand that some facts of life don't work for everyone. And so we have to understand ways that we can address it. As someone who worked in research, right, who worked at the University of California, who understands the value of research and data, I'm not as scared, perhaps because I have an expertise and a background in understanding the value of making data public. And I think that that is exactly why we're also allowing for these companies to explain the data. So the data is not just thrown out there without an explanation. Companies will have the opportunity to have their own explanation so that adds to the narrative. We've also taken a number of amendments around this, that the aggregate data that is publicized alone cannot be a cause for lawsuit, because at the end of the day, what might make data scary to them is that they feel a lawsuit can come on. However, we believe very strongly that the act of disclosing accurate data publicly is not an act of shaming, that is something that is useful for all of us to understand to address a problem that they recognize that they have. They don't dispute that there is a gender pay gap or a race pay gap. And so as an elected representative, I think that this is a really important piece to trying to address that.
And you do bring up a point here that it does have real life applications, because how many young women, how many women of color, workers of color out there are disheartened when they're working in a job, feeling satisfied, proud of the work they do, but then they discover how much less the women are making than the men are in that same job, doing that same work.
Oh, absolutely. It's not only discouraging. I mean, I think that beyond discouraging, it's a reason why people question whether they should go back to that company that has that disparity, that's not actively doing something to address it. And I think that this is 2022. We have incredible ways to tell, to share information, to understand the data that's put out there publicly. And so I think that we can solve for all of the challenges and explain to people, here is why. We understand that years of service matter. We understand that, prior experience, prior salaries all matter. All of that stuff matters and answers into equation. But I think we're at a point in 2022 in California that we can talk about complicated equations that equate to an outcome. I think that that's acceptable.
On that same note, you probably read the story about the U.S. Soccer Association and the players. Most significantly, the women players have reached an agreement on a deal that really sets the global standard for money in soccer, a hard-fought and hard-won deal, equalizing World Cup money awarded to the teams, participating and sharing revenue and broadcast rights, partnerships and sponsorships, and encompassing other areas, and I thought this was very profound: childcare, parental leave, mental health treatment, travel, and venue quality. You don't get the crappy fields to play on just because, you're a women's team. This is a profound change, and I think what's particularly profound is it, I think, sets an example to young women, younger girls who are playing and see themselves as professional soccer players in 5 to 10 years. It makes a difference to them that they see it's worth the effort.
Absolutely. Major kudos and gratitude to the U.S. women's soccer team for fighting this in such a very public way, for making sure that in the U.S. we understand that these discrepancies and that these gaps still exist and that they need to be addressed, that there are a body of people who want to work to address them. So kudos to the U.S. women's soccer team. But the U.S. women's soccer team had a lot of national press and media that so many workers don't.
That's a very good point. Yeah.
And so that's something I'm always reminded about, right? That, well, that victory for the U.S. women's soccer team made it to the front page of almost every major newspaper, right, in the country, that there are so many women who don't have that press, who don't have the light shined on them, and who people don't know. And so I wanted to do something in California that did not keep those women in the shadows, that understood that there are a lot of unseen Latinas, unseen in the workforce, unseen African-American women, Native women. I mean, the list goes on, API women who are not seen in that data. So I think for us, this bill is also about ensuring, again, that moment of being unseen is why data is so important to make public. And so I think that that is a key element to this. We want to see all of the women in the workforce, and we want to see that they in the future have the opportunity to make the same as men for the same job. We are still talking about the same job.
Let's segue to another aspect of women in the workplace 2022, one with some evidence of positive growth and career promotion for women leaders. Pay for women CEOs rose 26% last year, providing a sign of more progress in gender parity in the corporate boardrooms. But only 15% of CEOs at Fortune 500 companies are women. And the number of women on boards of these companies in California has more than doubled in 2018, thanks to the law signed then, authored by your predecessor in your Senate seat, Hannah Beth Jackson, that required all publicly held California corporations put women on their boards of directors. That has led to an incredible increase, but the conservative legal groups came after it as soon as it became law, decrying it as a woman's quota law, and have argued that it violates California's Constitution and its Equal Protection Clause, and they challenge that the law undermines the very concept of equality. And then in May, as you know, the LA Superior Court judge, a woman, I just want to point out here, she agreed with that thinking and she struck the law down. What's your reaction to this? We've seen success with this, but the courts won't have it.
So I think there's multiple reactions to this. First and foremost, when SB 826 passed, the Women on Corporate Board law, it immediately had a positive outcome.
Yes.
And so no one can deny that this law passing alone resulted in outcome of having more women on corporate board. I mean, within the first 12 months, we saw a meaningful increase. And so I think that what it did is it raised and created a narrative that was really important among companies. People started asking, well, what's your company doing, right? If I'm a consumer, a customer supporting your company, am I reflected? Is someone like me reflected on your board? And so that came, I think, as a result of a lot of the conversation and discourse that was happening with this bill. Senate Bill 826 also took on a national conversation. And I think that all of those things helped achieve a certain outcome. I think the court's decision is certainly disheartening. However, I don't think that it's the end. I think that we continue to raise these issues and apply them, and I think that we will go through the process. But I do want to just recognize that it had the outcome that it was intended to have. And that was really important, and we hope that that's not lost on this. That even if there are companies who felt that this law forced them to do something that they didn't want to do, we're still working to figure out a way to get companies to want to do this on their own and not need a law to do this. But unfortunately, what we've learned is that a lot of people, even on pay equity, have wanted to do the right thing for 40, 50 years. But after 40 or 50 years, you say, all right, a law needs to come in now, because it turns out that wanting to do the right thing hasn't achieved the outcomes that we all want. We are a body of legislators that are constantly looking and revamping our laws and trying to figure out how to address these problems. So I know that there will be additional laws in the future, because that's just the work we do. We look at the court cases. We look to see if there's different things that could be done to help achieve the outcomes we want. And I don't believe that the desire to see less women in, the corporate world and boardroom is something that is a desire of our legislature.
Interestingly enough, also struck down was a related law requiring boards of public corporations to increase the number of directors from unrepresented racial and ethnic groups by the end of this year. And in fact, boardroom racial and ethnic diversity has increased over the last couple of years. Not so much with Latina women, unfortunately. We can speak to that. What do you have to say to that and the fact that yet another progressive piece of legislation gets defeated by a high court?
Right. Well, I think that was really in line with the last piece, right? So the Assemblymember Holden bill came after Senator Jackson's bill, but I think both were intended to make these changes. And I think that one of the important elements across all of this is that whether it's the gender pay gap or the racial pay gap, we still see that women of color are actually at the bottom of all of that, whether it's on corporate boardrooms, whether it's a salary issue. That is something that, as women of color, we try to raise. Almost on every front, women of color are really unseen. Our data points don't show that we're making, the progress that we'd like to see for equity. And we'll continue to raise that. I think more women of color are getting elected to the legislature. I think it's shifting. Certainly we have more women of color now than we've ever had in the California legislature.
That's great.
And so that is, those things are changing, and we're trying to also raise an awareness because we want everyone to succeed. And I think that sometimes in this conversation and the debate about some of this, there's a perception that in order for one to win, someone has to lose. And I think that that's inaccurate perception. I think that there are ways to create opportunities and gains for everyone who's in the workforce. This isn't about identifying who wins and who loses as much as saying the playing field and the level has to be one that everyone can find their own gains in this and opportunities in this work. But it's not going to happen unless we see systemic change, right? Where the system changes. And we don't always see the system changes just because someone has a desire. Oftentimes laws have to come into place to see the system itself change.
And it must be frustrating for you and your colleagues as lawmakers to see progressive state laws like the ones we've just talked about get struck down by the higher courts pushing back, not just on gender-related laws, but on workplace safety, on gun safety. Are you and your colleagues sensing some sort of a trend here?
Well, I will say that these laws always start off with, pushback even here. However, we've talked about these two laws, and certainly there's, other laws in other spaces, but they are a small fraction of the laws that get challenged. The majority of laws don't get challenged. Or if they do, they are still the law because we were successful in moving them forward. So I don't want this law, Senate Bill 826 and what was challenged, to be the narrative of all laws that we do around pay equity, because the truth is that the majority of them don't get challenged in the courts, or if they do, the court side with the state of California, that they are constitutional and they are legal to do. And so that to me is very important. We will always have some that are challenged, and we work with an incredible team here, Ledge Council and others, to help us craft those laws so that should they be challenged in the courts, we're in a better position to uphold our own laws. But I think that the minority of the laws get challenged in the court, but the great majority remain the law, which means we are moving in the right direction.
That's good to hear. Well, as we wrap here on a sobering note, and not trying to sound too sobering, but if the last couple of years have taught us nothing else, it's the fact that there's a lot of sobering things going on. Considering the different progressive laws that are being overturned, legislatures and the courts across the states canceling out a lot of these long-held and hard-fought rights and freedoms, abortion rights, reproductive rights, voting rights. How do you, as a lawmaker in 2022, as a woman of color, a mother, wrap your head around really what is a pivotal moment in our cultural and moral discourse? It seems in a lot of ways there's some regression here of what has been long, hard fought for.
It is, and I will say I have a lot of feelings, and that's probably an entire podcast.
Yes.
And one, I will recognize that as a woman legislator, I really believed, and for so many years, that the fight on reproductive choice was a fight that the generation before us fought, and that there was no way that that could be taken away from us. Turns out that we are living in a moment where it can be taken away from us, and that is certainly concerning to a great extent for me, not just personally or professionally, but legislatively and legally, like what this means. But I think that it is the generations before us that have also taught us that you work at this every single day. You work at this every single year. You ensure that even in a time when these laws are being challenged in the court, where there is concern that they will be overturned, that we don't stop working together and trying to advance what we believe is really important for women. So I think what you're seeing in California is a response to all that. A lot of feelings, but also saying, look, there is a package of legislative items that we can address, that we can move forward, that will help. They don't solve the situation, and they don't solve that this right, reproductive choice could basically be overturned for the entire country. But they do address what we can do here in this state. So I think that I feel that I am part of a body with, the Democratic Women's Caucus, the Women's Caucus as a whole, who is really looking at these laws, what's being overturned, but also understanding that that is our job. Our job is to try to find a way to advance the work, the rights, the values, the opportunities, the, situations that help women in the state. So we will be continuing to explore that, but I do feel optimistic in the series and package of bills that the legislature is moving forward on this particular topic as it relates to reproductive choice. I didn't see myself here in 2022 having to think about this and having a conversation about Roe v. Wade being overturned in a very direct and real way. So we will see that unfold, but I think there is a lot more to come on that.
Thanks for keeping it real and ending this on a positive and affirming note. And yes, we could do podcasts on all your legislative portfolio, so hopefully we can have you back here again. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Brian.
Good luck with SB 1162, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
State Senator Monique Limón of Santa Barbara, and that brings us to a close of this edition of Then There's California. We're a production of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus, with technical assistance and production support from Martin Ashley, Bob Brolte, Brian Shadden, Rainier Saviniano, McLeana Woods, Lisa Murphy, and the graphic artistry of Tim Davis. On behalf of State Senator Monique Limón, I'm Brian Green at the State Capitol in Sacramento. Thanks for listening to Then There's California.